I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts, and welcome to a bonus video for the Quilts for Baby and Beyond Sew Along. When I recently showed my niece Ellie's nursery, it included a custom crib sheet that I made to match some of the quilts that I made her. Some of you showed an interest in knowing how I put that together, so I filmed a simple tutorial to show you how easy it is to make a crib sheet from cotton fabric that you normally use on a quilt. Let's get started. A coordinating crib sheet is a great addition when giving a quilt as a baby gift. It's easy and simple to make. Here's what you'll need. 2 yards of fabric that matches the quilt that you have made, a ruler that's at least 8 by 8. If you don't have that, you can make a paper template, rotary cutter, scissors, pencil, 2 medium to large safety pins, and 2 yards of 1/4 inch elastic. To start, we're going to set the elastic and the pins aside, and we need to begin by cutting the corners out of our fabric so that we can make the mitered corners for our fitted crib sheet. In addition to this tutorial today, I do have step-by-step photo directions available on my blog with a link below. The first step is I need to go ahead and cut a square out so that I can miter my corners to create my fitted sheet. So I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to line up my 8-inch lines, and I'm going to go ahead and keep this selvage. Usually we would trim that off. I'm going to go ahead and keep that, and it's going to be enclosed underneath my elastic, so don't trim that off. We want the full 44 to 45 inch width so that it properly fits a standard crib. So we're going to go with our 8 and our 8, and I instinctively grabbed my rotary cutter, but that's not what we're going to start with. I'm going to start with my pencil, and I'm going to draw my lines, and I can begin to cut them with a rotary cutter, but I want to make sure that I don't use the rotary cutter for the full length, because then I'm going to accidentally cut into my crib sheet. So I'm just going to cut part way, and I'm going to do the rest of that with scissors, and I'm going to turn this so that I'm not cutting towards myself. Line my ruler back up, and again, cut part way. You could also just cut all of this with scissors. Just cut right there on my line and right there. I'm going to repeat for all 4 corners. Now that I have cut all 4 of my corners, it's time to go ahead and sew them together. And instinctively, you would normally put right sides together. But what's going to happen is we're going to have a raw edge on the inside. And for something like a crib sheet that's going to be washed often, it's not a nice final finished look, as well as it'll unravel. So for something like this, I'd like to go ahead and do what's called a French seam. So a French seam is going to encase our raw edges. So we're going to start by actually folding it this way with our wrong sides together, and we're going to pin this in place and head over to our machine, and we're going to start by sewing this with an 1/8 inch seam, and then we're going to flip it and sew it on the other side to encase this raw seam, and I'll show you that over at the machine. I'm over at my machine, and I have my piece that I pinned over at my cutting station, and I'm now going to sew an 1/8 inch seam along this piece, wrong sides together. My machine is set for 1/4 inch, so I'm just going to be an 1/8 inch inside of this guide here so that I get my 1/8 inch seam, and I am going to backstitch at the beginning and end of this seam. I'm going to remove my pins as I go. And I'm now just going to repeat this on all 4 corners. Now finish doing all 4 of my corners, and the next step is to flatten this out, and now we're going to sew it as we normally would, right sides together, and we're going to sew it with a little bit of a generous 1/4 inch seam. So I'm going to open it up. No need to get your iron on. Just go ahead and finger press this seam down nice and flat so that when I go like this and I pinch it, I can contain all of that raw edges in this seam. And you'll see when I finish this in a moment, it'll end up looking like this from the right side, where you don't see anything, and like this from the wrong side. So it's a nice way, a French seam is a nice way to encase all your raw edges. So again, I'm just going to pin this to keep it nice and flat. And I have my machine now set up for a generous 1/4 inch seam. And again, I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and end and remove my pins as I go. Never want to sew over a pin. Do a little backstitch. So this is what it looks like from the right side. So it's a nice square corner. And so I'm going to go ahead and repeat that process on the other 3 corners. You can see I trimmed any loose threads that might not have been encased in the seam allowance. Now that I've completed sewing my corners, my crib sheet is starting to look more like a fitted sheet and less like a flat sheet. Now the next step is to sew the channel to put my elastic in, which will complete the fitted sheet. Before I sew my casing around the perimeter of my crib sheet, I'm going to go ahead and switch feet. Don't want my 1/4 inch foot on at this point. I just want a standard foot. I'm going to go with a clear foot so that I can see what I'm doing. I could go ahead and fold my 1/2 inch and my 1/2 inch and go ahead and pin or clip all the way around. But I'm actually just going to fold and sew as I go. This does not need to be exact, and if you're off a little bit here and there, that's a-okay. I am going to put 1 pin in place so that I know where I started. I'm going to start about 1 inch after that pin, and I'm just going to simply do a straight stitch. I'm going to go and do a couple stitches backwards, and I'm going to fold a 1/2 inch and a 1/2 inch. And I'm going to sew about 10 inches at a time. And then stop, and then get the next 10 inches ready. One thing I do want to be consistent about is I want to make sure that all of my corners go in the same direction. That will help when I'm threading my elastic through. So I suggest not having them go towards your machine, have them come towards you. It's more natural with your presser foot. So again, I'm going to fold my 1/2 inch and then another 1/2 inch. And I'm just going to be gentle when I get there since I'm not using a walking foot. You could use a walking foot for this step. Just going to go nice and slow. And I'm going to continue until I get close to where I started. And my thread decided to break, as happens sometimes. So I'm just going to quickly rethread my machine. And no need to remove anything since this is all going to be on the underside and won't be seen. I'll just overlap about 1 inch. I'll trim those loose ends off later. So again, fold my 1/2 inch, my 1/2 inch, and keep going. And as you can see, this is one of my selvage edges, and it gets completely folded in so you don't see it. So no worries about not cutting that off in the beginning. Now I'm getting close to where I started, and I do want to leave about 3-4 inches of an opening to get my elastic in with my safety pin. And one final thing that you can do as an added little touch is if you have a woven label with your name or your blog on it, you can go ahead and add that in here. It's a nice little finished touch that will be on the inside of the crib but a nice little accent. So I'm going to go ahead and add that here at this point. And you just simply slip it underneath after you've folded your 1/2 inch and your 1/2 inch, and you can put it in as at least a 1/4 inch, but you don't have to put it the full 1/2 inch if it'll take some of your design away. Usually I sew this in with binding, so it's a 1/4 inch. So I'm just going to stick it partway in. Just gives that nice professional look to things. And I'm going to stop about 3-4 inches before I started. So my pin is my good reminder to where I started. Backstitch. After sewing the casing, it's now time to install the elastic to complete the fitted sheet. I suggest having 2 safety pins, one at the end to feed into the casing and the other at the end to make sure that it doesn't come out. I'll show you what I mean. I've made these quite a few times and accidentally made the mistake of focusing on the end that I'm pulling through without realizing that the other end has snaked its way through. So I'm going to take the end that I'm not using and I'm just going to pin it to the opening right here, as you can see. Now, I know that I'm going to be going this way because I sewed my 4 corners down this way. Double check, make sure you might have to go this way. Just make sure you're going in the direction so that when you get to this seam here, you're going with your seam instead of against it. If you're going against it, you might get caught like this in your channel and that makes things difficult. So just go ahead and take your pin and thread it through. This is a very slow, meditative process. I often do this not at the machine. You don't have to be sitting at your machine for this. I'll often do this while sitting watching TV or hanging out with my kids. You're just going to simply go all the way around, and this is going to ensure that when I get close, I don't accidentally pull all my elastic through. Since I have 2 yards of elastic and I'm going around more than 2 yards, which is what's going to create that cinch. As you can see, while I am working it in, I also stretch the elastic and move it down so that it doesn't get too bunched up, and continue to pull in the elastic from the end of my project. And this is why it's important that I place that safety pin so that I don't accidentally pull it in too far. I am almost back here at the beginning, and it looks like I somehow ended up with a knot in my elastic when I started, so I'm going to make sure I take that out before I put my 2 ends together. Sometimes it can get tangled up when you have it cut sitting waiting to be used. So now that I have this end out, I want to make sure that doesn't go back in, so I'm simply going to use this safety pin to pin that right there. That way it'll keep that elastic from going back in. I'm going to unpin my original one and undo this knot here. You probably won't have this, but if you do, no problem. Just untwist it. There we go. Now what I want to do is I want to create one continuous elastic loop. So I'm going to pull both my ends out a couple inches, and I have an open foot, and I'm going to set myself to a zigzag stitch. I'm going to make sure it's narrow enough to be totally on my 1/4 inch wide elastic. And I'm going to set mine to 2 long, 2.5 wide. Every machine has slightly different settings, so you might want to test yours out on a scrap to see what it looks like first. I have pink thread in here right now so that I can see well what it's going to look like. Yep, that one's going to be perfect, I think. So I'm going to overlap them by about 1 inch. And I'm going to go ahead and lift up my foot. I'm going to go nice and slow on this. Back stitch a little bit just to make sure it's nice and secure. And you can feel free to pull your piece through if needed because it's not necessarily on the feed dogs since it's kind of centered in between them. So you might have to push your piece through manually. Okay. And after you have that all secured, just trim any loose threads that you get. And this is the fun part. You simply go like this and it pops in to the rest of the casing. Now I want to switch my machine back to a straight stitch and put my project back on the same way that when I was sewing the casing in the first place. And I know I've said casing and channel, kind of interchangeable, it serves the same purpose here. Apologize if I've caused any confusion with that. And I want to sew up this opening of these 3 inches here. So I'm going to start about 1 inch past where I ended before and go about 1 inch past. Try back stitch. Okay, and just trim off any loose threads. And your crib sheet is complete. So time to go ahead and wash it and put it on a crib and enjoy it. Thanks for joining me here today. If you've enjoyed this video, please be sure to like it, subscribe, and leave your comments with us. Your comments requesting this video on how to do a crib sheet are why I filmed today's video. You also can set up notifications to receive an alert every time that I film a new video. If you have a request for future videos, please be sure to leave those in the comments.